In the upcoming clip, Chomsky speaks about the Jewish lobby AIPAC. He has consistently criticized AIPAC for its considerable influence on U.S. politicians and policy towards Israel. He has argued that AIPAC's lobbying efforts often skew U.S. foreign policy decisions in favor of Israel's interests, sometimes at the expense of other considerations such as human rights or international law.
And Noam, I'd like to ask you another question that we discussed earlier. Recently you said on Democracy Now! That Israeli intervention in U.S. elections vastly overwhelms anything the Russians may have done. Can you elaborate on that? How is it that both Israelis themselves and the Israeli lobby in the U.S. functions?
Well, sometimes it is so blatant that it's kind of mind-boggling. So you may recall that the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, showed up at the invitation of some right-wing members of Congress to deliver an address to the joint session of Congress without notifying the White House even, in which he used his address to condemn Obama's policies, mainly with regard to Iran. Obama had helped initiated the negotiations that led to the joint program, the Iran nuclear deal, and this is anathema to Netanyahu, who wants the U.S. to support an attack on Iran. So here's a prime minister of another country showing up in Congress, completely ignoring the state executive, the White House, and telling them, we've got to, you guys have got to completely reverse his policy. It's almost impossible to think of a form of intervention in the legislative process that exceeds this. And this is only a very small part of it. You just take a look at the main funders of both the Republican and the Democratic Party. In the Republican Party, it's people like Sheldon Adelson, tens of millions of dollars, ultra-right, a supporter of the ultra-right Israeli nationalism settlement programs. On the Democratic side, Chaim Saban is a huge, another billionaire, huge supporter. You look through the rest of the donors, it's the same. There are lobbying groups, open lobbying groups like AIPAC, which basically agencies of the Israeli government, which are constantly twisting the arms of people in Congress. It is so far beyond anything that is attributed to the Russians that you just can't even compare it. And I should say that, side comment, when we're considering the intervention in our pristine democratic process, it's worth bearing in mind that even the Israeli intervention, which is far beyond any other country, is minuscule as compared with the corruption of the political process by simply funding of candidates. Now, this is not just since Citizens United that opened the faucet a little wider, but it goes back over a century. You go back to 1895. There was a great famous campaign manager, Mark Hanna, was asked once, what are the important things that you need for a political campaign? And he said, the first thing is money, and the second thing is money. And I've forgotten what the third is. That was the 1890s. And in fact, it's extensive, important work in academic social science, political science, which shows that you can literally predict the outcome of an election with remarkable precision simply by looking at the one variable of campaign spending. That's both for president and for Congress, and it runs through the 2016 campaign, incidentally. And that's just a small part of it, since electability depends on campaign funding, that means your congressional representative, once he or she is elected, their first task is to get funding for the next election. Meanwhile, what happens to the legislative process? Well, corporate lobbies are invited to talk to the staff, the congressional staff, and instruct them about what the legislation ought to be. And this reaches the point where they actually write the legislation. They're written by corporate lobbyists, signed by the congressional representative. This is one reason why other work demonstrates that for about 70% of the voting population, the lower 70% on the income scale, are completely disenfranchised, literally, in the sense that their own representatives pay absolutely no attention to their opinions. They're listening to the donor class. Talking about interference in the elections in a system like this is kind of ludicrous in the first place. But if we want to talk about foreign interference, there's nothing remotely to compare with the Israeli interference. It's perfectly open and blatant. They don't even try to conceal it.
Thank you.
Chomsky has highlighted the role of money in politics, including contributions from pro-Israel groups like AIPAC, as a major factor in shaping U.S. elections and policy. He suggests that campaign donations and lobbying efforts by AIPAC contribute to a political environment where politicians are incentivized to support policies aligned with AIPAC's agenda. Chomsky has been critical of U.S. support for Israel in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He argues that U.S. military aid to Israel, diplomatic support, and reluctance to hold Israel accountable for human rights violations contribute to the perpetuation of the conflict and hinder efforts towards a just and lasting peace. Chomsky has advocated for amplifying alternative voices in U.S. politics that challenge the influence of lobbying groups like AIPAC. He believes that fostering a more diverse and inclusive political discourse is essential for advancing a foreign policy agenda that prioritizes peace, justice, and human rights in the Middle East. I hope you liked the video and give the channel a subscribe. Now take care and bye-bye.